Hi there and welcome to Sector Report. I'm Drew Chappell, standing in for David Beatson. Well, this week we explore the volatile New Zealand wine industry. Annual exports of more than 100 million litres of wine add up to about $1 billion a year to our economy. But poor growing conditions have seen many wineries and contract growers confronting smaller yields, with some even shutting up shop. Philip Gregan reveals what this season holds for growers and us consumers. Also, the latest in the thorny issue of foreign ownership. We talk to a businessman determined to halt the flow of productive land into overseas hands. And we travel to Taranaki to investigate the fate of a community faced with an Austrian investor and his controversial plans for 2,000 hectares of sheep and beef country.
Don't just have your bit of paper in front of you and tick boxes, pretty much. Come in here and see what the land is like and see what the community is and what it's going to do to the community.
Well, Whangamomana doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, and you'd struggle to find it on a map. But it's the latest rural community battling implosion. That's because a huge chunk of farmland has recently been bought up by a European investor who wants to plant the area in pine forests. Residents fear they'll lose local businesses and several farming families from the township. We wanted to know more about what they want the government to do about it. Taranaki has always been farming country. Everywhere you look, hills and plains are covered in sheep and cattle. And this year, after a great summer, plenty of grass too. Here in the north of the region though, everything could be about to change.
Oh yeah, we're definitely 100% reliant on farming, sheep and beef farming out here. Yeah. There's a lot of shearers out here and seasonal workers I suppose, fencers, and keeps a lot of young people employed and contractors and whatever,
Walter Peace has lived here in Whangamomana his whole life. Like many Kiwis growing up in the country, farming sheep and playing rugby have been his two passions. Now, with a young family of his own, he's worried about plans to sell off more than 2,000 hectares of surrounding land to an overseas investor, an investor who plans to convert the farms into forest.
We're a small enough community as it is, and the way things are gone with farming, with mechanisation and that, there's a lot less people out here than there was 10, 20, 30 years ago. But, and that's our concern, is that you plant this type of country out into trees, there'll be a little bit of work at the start for planting and maybe a prune or two, but for the next 30 years the gate will be shut really and there won't be any work.
Situated in the heart of Taranaki sheep and beef hill country, the tiny hamlet of Whangamomana is home to around 120 people, most of whom live and work on the farms surrounding the area. It's no wonder then that the potential loss of 4 families has many in the community worried. Locals like Colin Couchman. He's a farm owner just a few properties north of Walter. The district has been home for Colin for 12 years, which in these parts makes him a true blue local.
It's a fantastic community. Everybody knows everybody. It's a lot of us get together down the pub, on a Friday night or a Saturday night and have a few beers and generally find out what's going on with everybody else around the area, So it is a good area. It is a good area, and it's a good farming area. Like I said, if someone gets hurt around here or something happens, there's always someone to jump in and help out.
The property next door to the Couchmans, a 700-hectare grazing block, has been on the market since 2010. Yet until now, no one in the area could afford to make an offer. But now, with stock returns high and farmers feeling flush, Colin has finally convinced his bank to back him in a bid for the property. But it's to no avail.
We've been pretty keen on it. We've got a family of 4. They've all left home, but one of my daughters and her partner are pretty keen they're in farming at the moment for other people, and they want a career in farming. And we thought, well, we like being here. Why don't we try and buy next door and put them in there and start off hopefully their career in farming. That's what we're after.
Colin's major gripe is no matter how much money they offered the neighbours for the property, it would never have been enough to trump the deep pockets of the overseas interests, an Austrian investment firm. And that, he says, is not a level playing field.
You can't blame anybody for wanting to get the highest price they can for a property. You know, I'd want the same thing. And that's not what this issue is about, really. The issue that we're about is the Overseas Investment Office, their criterion that for letting investors, overseas investors, into buying this land is one thing, but then changing the land use, there'll be no land left in areas like this. It'll get bought up by overseas investors because our land is cheap compared with overseas, and that's the reason, I gather, that they come in here to buy this sort of land.
The deal for the 4 properties has recently been given the green light from the OIO, the Overseas Investment Office. All that remains is for all parties to sign on the dotted line. Forestry lobbyists claim sheep farming is a dying industry, and on land like this, pine forests will make more money. Locals, however, don't agree.
It's certainly fairly hard for young people to get into farming now. This seems to be one of the places they do get in. It's as a rule, it's probably cheaper land in a lot of places. Like, it's pretty gnarly. It's young man's country, a lot of people say. So it's somewhere for them to make a start. A lot of guys got in here by sharing or contracting or fencing. That's how they've made their money to pay the mortgage. There's plenty of guys done that out here.
Trains don't come through Whangamomina anymore, although the tracks are still here, a ghostly testament to a more prosperous time. And symbolic of the decline of sheep farming in New Zealand over the last 20 years, from the hustle and bustle of its heyday in the 80s, when flock numbers peaked at more than 70 million. Since then, conversions to dairy and forestry have become the rule rather than the exception. For those stalwarts who have held out and held on, it's gratifying indeed to finally reap some rewards.
I wouldn't call it a dying community at all. There's a few young farmers out here. What I say young farmers, probably the youngest of them might be getting very close to 30. And I can't really see much younger ones coming on at this stage for anywhere. Just the way that farms are gone, got dearer and dearer, but it is a very good community after all that, yeah.
Money aside, the truth is the town may soon struggle to keep the few businesses that remain afloat, faced with an exodus of families and customers. This despite promises from the prospective overseas owners that they won't leave Whangamomina high and dry.
We don't really want handouts from, like the guy that owns the trees. He could flick us some, a bit of money for Republic Day or whatever, but that's not what it's about for us. We'd rather have 4 families here going to school and helping out on community days. That's more important than a few bucks here or there to prop something up.
Walter and his family worry that deals like this one have already destroyed other communities, and their town could be the next domino to fall.
We've talked to people further afield in Gisborne and so forth where it has already happened, where bulk trees have been planted, and from what we hear from them, the communities have just died over there, really. The trees have started at one end of the road and kept going, and when you're the last farm on the road, I guess it's pretty hard to stay there when you're surrounded by trees.
That's why residents like Colin and Walt have been busy writing to the Overseas Investment Office, appealing for reason.
And one of the letters, yes, we invited them to come down and actually have a look at the area, the community, and don't just have your bit of paper in front of you and tick boxes, pretty much. Come in here and see what the land is like, and see what the community is and what it's going to do to the community.
So far, their calls and letters have gone largely ignored. But for the sake of their future, they and the small town of Whangamomina won't go down without a fight.
But I'm not prepared to sit on my hands and let this sort of thing carry on. We've got to start somewhere. A lot of people I've talked to said, you're pushing shit uphill. Hey, well, we probably are. But we need to start somewhere.
Well, coming up, we speak to the lawyer representing Kiwi businessmen intent on keeping farmland under New Zealand ownership. Stay with us here on Sector Report. Welcome back to Sector Report. Tony Bouchier and the Save the Farms group first appeared on the public radar 2 years ago when a highly publicised ad campaign criticising the proposed sale of the Crayfer farms to Chinese company Natural Dairy hit the headlines. Now, more than a year after first appearing here on Sector Report, Tony Bouchier is back for a timely update. And thanks for joining us again today, Tony.
Good morning.
Well, last time you were on the show here back in 2010. It seems a long time ago.
It does.
Mei Wang is a name familiar to everyone. She was almost public enemy number one in some circles. Your group, when they came out with the ad campaign, which, as many people will remember, there were a couple of big features in the Herald and then a couple of billboards and things like that. You really had the two main aims of the Save the Farms campaign. One, that immediate sort of moratorium on overseas land sales, and the second one was a nationwide discussion about what foreign land sales mean to Kiwis. Now, certainly on that second point, I suppose the group can have no complaints after what we've seen last year.
That's certainly the case. We have had that national discussion. It is ongoing. We have been absolutely amazed that our simple message had such resonance out there in the community. They picked up and ran with it. We've got most of the political parties on board, except, of course, our present government. That's a good thing. We didn't achieve the moratorium on the sale of land to overseas investors, but certainly with the momentum and the Michael Fay consortium going to the court, we achieved that in a roundabout sort of way.
Righty, so would that be perhaps a reason for the group's sort of comparative silence after, suppose, starting with a bang and then almost kind of been a bit quiet lately? Is that a reflection of satisfaction with the way that things have been going?
It might appear that we've been silent, but that's not been the case at all. I'm doing probably weekly interviews. I am regularly contacted by overseas news services about what is happening here. So we might not have the profile, we may not be spending the money on marketing and advertising, but we certainly still are, the press, the media are still looking to us for comment. The Crayfer Farms continues to fester away there, and with everything that's occurred in the last 12 months with Crayfer Farms, for example, the media are still coming to us and looking to us for comment, and so are the community. Yeah.
With that Crayfer Farms issue, how does the group feel about how it's gone? A couple of months ago we saw that OIO ruling overturned by the High Court. That must have come as welcome news.
It came as the High Court overturning through judicial review, overturning the sale. It did come as welcome news. We are just sorry that this government haven't listened to the message of New Zealanders. New Zealanders do not want New Zealand horticulture and agriculture land sold to overseas investors. It's a shame our government doesn't hear that message loud and clear and do something about that.
One reason that you do give for that is because the barriers to entry into farm ownership for young Kiwi farmers is very high. Is that chiefly under threat by overseas corporations coming in, or are we seeing also sort of corporate farm owners and perhaps investor groups like My Farm also sort of adding to those barriers and making it difficult for young Kiwis to get a start in farming?
Well, we think that Crayfer Farms is a very good example of what can occur. We had Landcorp go in there and make a bid. We've had the Michael Fay consortium make a bid. Now, both of those bids, if you have a look at them, they're bids, they've offered a price where they want a return on investment. But the overseas investors, the Chinese, have come in and made a bid which is far higher than those other two consortiums, which don't reflect a return on investment. And that really is our concern, that these sovereign funds, they've got just barrel loads of money. They've got a longer term plan.
Righty. So in a sense, if you take these foreign interests away from the market, from many farmers, it's going to limit what they can get from the farms once they decide to bail out. It's going to push the price down.
Yes, I think we've got to agree that the corporates are in a position to pay a better price, say, for example, than the family farmer, because many of the corporates have huge acreages of land, and so that they can realise savings which, say, the individual farmer cannot. But what we do know is that the sovereign funds and the overseas investors certainly do lock out the young farmer that wants to go on the land here in New Zealand. If you have a look at what's happening in Australia, $2.5 billion worth of land has been sold in the last year, and that's what's in fact happening over there.
Righty. So then, wouldn't the sale of land to overseas investors, in the situation you've just described, isn't that more of I suppose, a symptom of the underlying problem, which is that it's just too expensive to get into farming and to stay on the farm?
It's our view that the whole economic model for farming has been a flawed one for a long period of time, is that farmers seemed to think that their profit was when they sold the land through capital gain. When the corporates come in, what they need is that they need a return on investment from day one. And that is the difference. And that really needs to be reflected in the price of land in the future, is that when the young farmer goes onto the land, that his profit is not when he retires and sells the land, but he in fact makes a profit in every financial year.
Heading back perhaps to the Crayford Farms issue once more,
Yeah.
and on that same vein, Ministers Coleman and Williamson now have the amended recommendations from the OAO before them. How do you expect that to be received if they come back saying yes and the sale can all go ahead?
Well, if the sale goes ahead, we'll be immensely disappointed, and I know that the public of New Zealand will be immensely disappointed. I know that, for example, if the FAE consortium will have another look at it, and I've absolutely no doubt at all that they will be going back to the court and asking the court to review the decision.
Right, so you'll be hoping for them to come back and that perhaps the recommendation is to go back to the drawing board and to reconsider and come back with a...
Our aim is to stop the sale of all horticulture and agricultural land to overseas investment. That includes the Crayford Farms, and we support the FAE team, their consortium, in anything that they do to try and stop the sale.
Tony Bouchier from the Save the Farms group. Well, coming up after this, we talk wine with industry leader Philip Gregan about weather, grapes and those Chinese knockoffs. That's after the break here on Sector Report. Welcome back. Malcolm Dunn once wrote that grapes are the most noble and challenging of fruits. One man who knows that better than anyone is Philip Gregan, the CEO of New Zealand Wine Growers, the national organisation that represents the interests of our grape growers and winemakers. He joins me in the studio now. Thanks for joining us, Philip.
Pleasure.
Excellent. Well, I thought a nice, easy place to start would be with this season, and I suppose the weather conditions over spring and summer that have had a lot of city folk sort of grumbling. It's been a late harvest in some regions, is that correct?
Yeah, it's the things that city people have complained about, grape growers and winemakers have complained about as well. We had a cool flowering in December. That's pushed the season back. It's made the crop smaller than it would otherwise be. And we're now really right in the midst of harvest, just praying for good weather. With
that smaller yield, with the fewer grapes, I suppose, coming off the vines, some have suggested that perhaps could be a good thing as well, as some growers pay more attention to the ones that they do have.
Yeah, it's the industry's had a supply-demand imbalance since 2008, 2009. And a slightly smaller harvest this year would have certainly helped correct that. The question nobody knows at the moment is just how big the harvest is going to be. The indications at the moment is it's going to be smaller rather than larger, and we're just hoping there's not going to be an overcorrection, if you would like.
And those harvest predictions are so crucial as well, aren't they? We were speaking to some avocado growers as well who say, the timing of the exports and the entry into certain markets are just really crucial with getting those predictions spot on.
Yeah, with a processed crop like wine, it's not so important as a fresh fruit crop. But certainly the later harvest this year is going to delay the early shipments of wines into the market, I would imagine.
If we look at some figures from Deloitte, long-term forecasts are indicating that the next 2 or 3 years we're going to see very strong demand and even strong enough to outstrip what we can produce. I mean, is there perhaps a danger of, if we do see strong prices for the next 2 or 3 seasons, that people are going to start buying up vineyards again, and we might see another perhaps bubble?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and really nobody knows the answer to it. But I think there are a number of factors that will constrain that. The most important one is there's been some very hard lessons learned over the past 3 or 4 years, and the number one of those lessons is don't get ahead of the market. Be very realistic about your forecasts about how much wine the market can take, what yields are off the particular vineyard site. So I think there have been some lessons learned which will mitigate against a rapid expansion in the vineyard area in the next, say, 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Right. One issue that some smaller vineyards and boutique wineries have voiced concerns over is about the bulk export of New Zealand wine. I think it's risen to around 40% of exports last year. Now, I mean, is this something that we should be concerned about, or is it simply a pressure release valve in a way to sort of trade surplus?
It's both those things. The Price Waterhouse report recently identified that it was a way to manage agribusiness risk, the ups and downs of vintages. For some producers, it's a way of removing cost out of the supply chain. However, on the other hand, it also potentially represents a threat to the reputation of New Zealand wine.
Well, just on that point, the Sustainable Wine Growing New Zealand label, it's a very important part of how we market our product overseas. And there has been some concern raised by smaller wineries about those who do export product in bulk and then have it bottled offshore, and whether or not they should have access to the Sustainable Wine Growing New Zealand label as well.
The question of sustainability is not whether a wine is packaged in New Zealand or whether it's packaged offshore. It's the processes that are used in the winery and in the packaging facility. And yes, there are concerns from some parts of the industry, but the view of New Zealand wine growers is it's entirely legitimate for wines that are packaged offshore to carry the Sustainable Wine Growing New Zealand logo, so long as they meet the criteria that are laid down.
Right, and for those perhaps wineries who don't wish to carry the Sustainable Wine Growing New Zealand label and bottle product offshore, have there been issues? I understand Stuart Smith has been talking about appealing to the Food Safety Authority about tightening up rules around that. Yes,
we've been speaking to New Zealand Food Safety Authority about the rules around bulk wine for some time. We are very hopeful that we'll see some changes. The challenge we have at the moment, there are 2 standards effectively, one for bottled wine and one for unpackaged wine. We'd like to see those standards married up so effectively they are the same. And I think there's a degree of sympathy from the Food Safety Authority about that issue.
So we could see some progress on that.
We are very hopeful.
But it's a slow, I mean, any sort of...
government processes take time, unfortunately.
They do. Onto a slightly different point now, the geographical indications legislation, so that's really determining which region our wines come from. I know that that's a concern to some growers in terms of in which way to demarcate our wine growing areas, and this has proven to be a problem in Australia in the past. Whether we take our lead from the old world wine growing areas of Europe, is that there's debate around it?
Yeah, there is some discussion about that issue. I don't think there's any debate about whether we should formalise geographical indications in the industry. Everybody agrees on that. The question is how far you go. In Europe, they have a system of appellation control which dictates things such as the varieties that can be planted, the yields of litres of juice per tonne of grapes that can be produced, the winemaking practices.
Just finally, and I mean, whenever we talk sort of any sort of productive industries, that China looms large on the horizon, and wine is certainly no different. I mean, their demand is expected to increase by 50% in the next 3 years, which is about a billion bottles. Is that seen by New Zealand wine growers as a key market for the future, given that at the moment we don't really export a lot there?
The answer is yes, and it's a fairly emphatic yes. There's lots of unknowns, of course, about the Chinese market, but if you put all those unknowns aside, the opportunity there is very significant. Every piece of data from every research house in the world says China is a growing force in the global wine industry. It's a growing force as a global wine market, and we need to be active in that place. we're working very hard with New Zealand Trade and Enterprise to develop a program to develop the Chinese market, and we're hopeful of some announcements on that in the not too distant future.
Great, well, we'll keep an eye out for those. Thank you for joining us. Philip Gregan of New Zealand Wine Growers. Well, that's all for this week. Remember, you can check all of our programming out online and get in touch with us and catch up with anything you might have missed at country99tv.co.nz. Well, thank you very much for your company. I'm Drew Chappell, and we'll see you next time on Sector Report.